We've all heard it a million times. No one needs an assault weapon to take down a deer. So why don't we just use normal firearms for our hunting and sporting purposes? Let's have a look. Welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be dismantling a common claim of the gun control types. This is the claim that no one needs a semi-automatic firearm for hunting or sport shooting, that they're somehow inappropriate or disproportionate for those purposes and civilians shouldn't have them. In fact, this is even the backbone for the Order in Council prohibitions, which happened over 5 years ago now in Canada.
But you don't need an AR-15 to bring down a deer.
These guns have no legitimate civilian purpose. They don't belong in our communities. And I will also say that the banning of these assault weapons is an important step. But let me also acknowledge that we know that there is much more to do.
Now, those clips were taken from May 1st, 2020 at the press conference where all of this nonsense started. That may seem like old news to a lot of people, but I think it's still useful to remember how we got here. Because for at least the last 5 years now, the government and the gun control types have claimed that we cannot be trusted to safely and responsibly own or use semi-automatic firearms, particularly the black and scary looking semi-automatic firearms. Now, of course, since then, the ban lists have expanded twice and go far beyond simply prohibiting AR-15 style firearms, and it's now the case that nearly all semi-automatic firearms have been banned in Canada, most of which were previously non-restricted firearms. And that is really the most important part there. Most of these newly prohibited firearms, both by volume and by family, were previously non-restricted firearms. Not weapons of war, not assault weapons, just completely normal, bog standard, non-restricted firearms. Now, for anyone who has been paying attention for the last 5 years, and really for a long time even before that, none of this is really any news. But what really inspired me to make this video was a post I saw on X about a couple of weeks ago now, from No Guns in Canada. Now, this user is a bit of a troll account and really shouldn't be taken too seriously. No Guns in Canada is absolutely not serious about their rhetoric and is very clearly just saying whatever they can simply to get a rise out of us already agitated and angry gun owners. The best thing that we can do is to stop replying and stop giving this account the attention that it is so desperate for. Remember, don't feed the trolls. And don't make videos about the trolls. However, on occasion, this rhetoric lines up rather closely with the official narrative circulating around out there. And today's narrative was the idea that these so-called assault-style firearms are unnecessary for hunting or protection from wildlife. More specifically, that if we want to hunt or protect ourselves from wildlife, we should get some bear spray or just use a regular rifle. Now, of course, there are a couple of problems with this. Firstly, necessity is a poor standard for freedom, because even a prisoner cannot be denied their needs in Canada. So if we want to live in a free country, we must not, under any circumstances, lower the bar for freedom down to mere necessity, as that would make us little more than prisoners. Now, secondly, and more importantly, just what the heck is a regular rifle? And why wouldn't a semi-automatic firearm qualify as a regular rifle? Well, here's the thing. They do. Semi-automatic firearms are generally considered non-restricted firearms under Section 84 of the Criminal Code, or at least they used to be, until the Liberal government arbitrarily decided that they should be declared weapons of war, which are somehow unsuitable for civilian use. Now, that's the debate that we've been having in Canada for at least a decade now, thanks to Trudeau. But so far as Parliament and the Criminal Code is concerned, semi-automatic firearms are supposed to be normal, regular, everyday non-restricted firearms, which are no different than really any other non-restricted firearm, provided they have a barrel length of over 470 millimeters and overall length of over 660 millimeters. Semi-automatic firearms are regular firearms in every sense of the word, so long as they meet those size parameters. However, if you're the gun control type, you might not like that answer or think that it's just the sad, deranged ramblings of the gun community or the gun lobby. But you don't have to take my word for it, or even the word of the Criminal Code for it, because we can look to the Supreme Court for this information as well. In the year 2000, there was a Supreme Court ruling called Reference Re Firearms Act, and in it, they referred to the various categories of firearms found in Section 84 of the Criminal Code. They said these categories were prohibited firearms, restricted firearms, and all other firearms. They then went into detail about what these other firearms are. And they said the third class of firearms is variously referred to as ordinary firearms, long guns, and unrestricted firearms. And we will refer to this class as ordinary firearms. So the Supreme Court here gave themselves several possible commonly used names to call our non-restricted firearms, and despite that, they opted to use the term ordinary firearms, because that's what non-restricted firearms are. They're not weapons of war, they're not weapons which are designed to kill the largest number of people in the shortest amount of time, they're not assault-style firearms, and they're certainly not military-grade assault weapons which have no place in Canada. In the year 2000, most semi-automatic firearms were considered absolutely normal and completely ordinary firearms by the Supreme Court of Canada. Like, I'm not sure what the gun control types mean by regular firearms, but surely an ordinary firearm would have to qualify as a regular firearm, right? So why is all of this so important? Well, most of the families of firearms which have been banned by the Order in Council since 2020 would have been these completely regular, ordinary, semi-automatic firearms. Because there are currently 240 firearms which have been singled out by name and prohibited by Order in Council. Now, prior to 2020, that number was only 86. So of the 154 families of newly prohibited firearms since 2020, 153 of those families would have been considered ordinary firearms by the Supreme Court just a couple decades ago. Now, let's be real here. Y2K is hardly ancient history. And then not even 15 years later, in the House of Commons, Justin Trudeau was already laying the groundwork to rebrand these ordinary firearms as assault weapons, even before he became Prime Minister. Now, it's likely he was using this terminology well before then, but certainly at least since then. This is a video from 2014 where he was already using the assault weapons rhetoric in debates with then Prime Minister Stephen Harper.
Mr. Speaker, C-42 would allow handguns and assault weapons to be freely transported in a trunk anywhere within a province.
So as you can see, in just 14 short years, our completely ordinary firearms somehow became assault weapons simply because it was politically expedient to do so.
That if you actually say it louder, we've learned in the House of Commons, if you repeat it, if you say it louder, if that is your talking point, people will totally believe it, so just go it.
In the span of my childhood, normal firearms were labeled weapons of war simply because politicians wanted them to be. But again, if you're the gun control type, one Supreme Court ruling may not be enough for you, for some reason. So let's take a look at another one, back in 1993, called the Crown versus Hasselwander. Now again, this is hardly ancient history. Most of the people watching this channel are older than this ruling is, and lots of you have probably owned firearms since before even that time. So Hasselwander was the case where they were deciding whether some semi-automatic firearms could be considered fully automatic firearms simply because their internal components could be replaced, thereby easily and readily converting it into an automatic firearm, meaning that these firearms were technically capable of fully automatic fire. Now, unfortunately, the Supreme Court ruled back then that such a firearm would still be an automatic firearm. However, since then, our current definition of a prohibited firearm has been worded slightly differently so as to account for this issue. However, the ruling is still relevant to us today because of the other things that the Supreme Court said during it. Now, much of the ruling is related to the legality and the reasonableness of the words of what capable and readily convertible meant, but at the same time, the Supreme Court also spent a good amount of time talking about the practical, functional, and public safety differences between semi-automatic firearms and fully automatic firearms, and specifically as to why it was so important to ensure that civilians be limited to having only semi-automatic firearms and not fully automatic ones. And here's what they said was the primary difference between the two and the primary purpose behind the prohibition of automatic firearms. It's something they said over and over and over in the ruling in multiple different ways and in no uncertain terms. And that purpose is to protect the public from these dangerous weapons that are designed specifically to kill or maim people. Where a weapon can be quickly and readily converted to automatic status, then that weapon must fall within the definition of a prohibited weapon. To come to any other conclusion would undermine the very purpose of the legislation. And then they went on this big rant delineating exactly what makes a semi-automatic firearm different from a fully automatic firearm as far as their capabilities are concerned. So they said, let us consider for a moment the nature of automatic weapons. That is to say that those weapons that are capable of firing rounds in rapid succession during one pressure of the trigger. These guns are designed to kill and maim a large number of people rapidly and effectively. They serve no other purpose. They are not designed for hunting any animal but man. They are not designed to test the skill and the accuracy of the marksman. Their sole function is to kill people. These weapons are of no value to the hunter or to the marksman. They should be used then only by the armed forces and in some circumstances, by the police forces. There can be no doubt that they pose such a threat that they constitute a real and present danger to all Canadians. There is good reason to prohibit their use in light of the threat to which they pose and the limited use to which they can be put. Their prohibition ensures a safer society. So in 1993, that is what made fully automatic firearms distinct and separate from semi-automatic firearms according to the Supreme Court. Now again, 1993 is not ancient history. Then 20 years later, our semi-automatic firearms also somehow became weapons of war which were designed to kill people. Now, during the CCFR's court case at the Federal Court of Appeal, Christine General really leaned into this line of argument and this line of thinking more than any other applicant did, and she said many of these exact things and much more. However, as many of you know, all of that fell on deaf ears when the Federal Court of Appeal ruled. It seems that nowadays the words of politicians and bureaucrats matter more to the court than the Supreme Court does. Like, facts and realities can apparently change on a whim simply because a politician wants it to. Which is obviously a pretty severe problem. Because politicians lie for a living. It's kind of what they do. If they're also allowed to be the arbiters of truth in Canada, we're gonna have a bad time. Not just as firearm owners, but especially as firearm owners. Because if any ordinary firearm can be rebranded as an assault weapon simply because a politician says it is, frankly, we're doomed. Everything is on the chopping block at that point. Everything. For example, back on June 13th, 1995, during the third reading of then Bill C-68 in Parliament, that's the bill which would later become the Firearms Act and related criminal code amendments, the leader of the bloc, Lucien Bouchard, claimed that ordinary 12-gauge shotguns can be assault weapons. So what that means is that this totally ordinary 12-gauge double-barrel shotgun can in fact be an extraordinary assault weapon in the mind of some politicians. If they're now the arbiters of truth, that is really bad news for us. Now you might think that there's no way such an argument could actually hold water or fly, but you'd be wrong because it's actually pretty easy to paint 12-gauge shotguns as an unreasonable weapon of war built for massacring people. Take this model 1897 shotgun as one such example. This firearm has another name. It's called a trench gun. Now, the actual trench guns, they had shorter barrels and bayonet lugs on them, but otherwise they're basically the same. Like, to use the language from the Order in Councils, the trench gun would be a modified version of this model 1897. Well, as a lot of you probably know, during World War I, from which the trench gun gets its namesake, the Germans alleged that this completely ordinary 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, that it violated the Hague Convention of 1907. In other words, they considered the use of this pump-action shotgun a war crime on the grounds that it caused undue human suffering. Keep in mind that at the same time, the two sides fired over 1 billion shells at each other over the course of the war on the Western Front alone. But 12-gauge shotgun? No, that's a bridge too far. That's a war crime. So what is the difference between a pump-action shotgun that is an alleged war crime and a pump-action shotgun that is designed for duck hunting? Well, the difference is politicians. We can't let politicians and rhetoric rule the day, or we're lost. And it's pretty easy to do what I just did with shotguns, with really any other firearm. Like, for those with a sharp's eye, you may have noticed that firearm on the ledge behind me. That's a Quigley gun from the movie Quigley Down Under. In the movie, our hero Quigley uses it to make a seemingly impossible bucket shot at over 700 yards, indicating that it is an excellent sniper rifle. And despite the fact that it's a single-shot rifle, Quigley also uses it to make short work of all of the evil cowboys throughout the movie. Now, as most of you know, the Liberals have frozen the market for handguns in Canada, but at the same time, 4 out of 5 Quigleys would agree that if you have one of those rifles, you probably ain't got much use for a handgun. So if handguns are outlawed and that rifle is far superior to a handgun, then it makes sense that the Sharps rifle should also be outlawed. Oh, and it was also used by sharpshooters on both sides of the American Civil War, making it a weapon of war.
You could call it that.
I guess I should have probably led with that. But what fun would that be? So not only can you make arguments like that for basically any firearm, but you can also do it with any other ordinary household thing, even if it isn't a firearm. Because the leader of the bloc also said something else that day in Parliament just moments later. One of the things he wanted out of Bill C-68, especially so far as registration was concerned, was to delegitimize gun owners and firearm ownership. And he said that one must realize that a firearm, and people will become more conscious of this fact, especially if they have to register it, is that a firearm is not an ordinary household object, but a dangerous weapon, which can be easily used to commit a crime or a violent act. Okay, well, this kitchen knife is an ordinary household item that can be used to commit a crime or a violent act. And this hammer is a totally ordinary household item which can be used to commit a crime or a violent act. So should kitchen knives and hammers also be registered? Should I have to prove to the government why I need one before I can have one? Worse still, should I be imprisoned for having one if I don't? Again, necessity cannot and must not become the threshold for freedom in Canada. We must not set the bar that low. Now, you may think that it's fair when it's being used against people that you don't like, but it will inevitably be used against you someday as well. We are all worse off if we're living in a Canada like that. So, what is a normal firearm? Well, every firearm which is a non-restricted firearm under a simplified classification system is a normal, regular, ordinary, everyday firearm. That includes all pump action, bolt action, lever action, brake action, single shots, muzzle loaders, and yes, that even includes semi-automatic firearms. It also includes the firearms which have been arbitrarily singled out by name by politicians and prohibited for political purposes. Semi-automatic firearms have been around for well over a century now, and frankly, they're not weapons of war, they're not designed for massacres, they're just regular, normal, standard, typical, everyday, ordinary firearms, and they always have been. All that being said, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.